lecture I'm going to be uploading, at least at this time, and I think we'll be back doing some live shows with these guys on Friday. This is the gets into a little more of the esoteric stuff, talking about the egregores, energetic fields. Egregores you could describe as collective thought form energetic entities. And so it's a pretty detailed explanation, and I think it demystifies a lot of this stuff. I wanted to do some commentary on, so like Adam Green was like basically bashing people that, the demons don't exist, there's nothing non-physical, etc. Well, you know, wait till you encounter that and then come talk to me, because there's a lot that is there. And he mentions like this rabbi who sees demons everywhere. Well, he may actually indeed perceive that. It doesn't mean he's just schizophrenic. And it also doesn't, I do agree with, with the idea that, psychedelics, the thing is that there are many types of things that, your mind will construct an experiential input that makes sense, right? And there's certain things that maybe are, depending on the level or state of your own consciousness, there's things that can actually basically shatter your conscious mind, right? And one of the issues with psychedelics is that you start playing around with this. Number one, you'll get an experience, right? But that experience is not going to be grounded with your actual life, right? So maybe you'll feel like you have some type of spiritual attainment, or you can see, interconnection of nature, or you see this being, or maybe you go to hell realm. But basically you're just opening yourself up for the implementation of other types of energetic fields and control systems. So I'll let this speak for itself. But yeah, and I saw that Tucker Carlson did something on, demons and rock music. He should have called me for the show, right? He didn't, but whatever. But I won't necessarily talk about my own personal experiences at this time, but this, just because you don't see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right? Just because you think that you're in this material plane, there's nothing beyond your five senses, there's no other types of entities or influences or impacts, that doesn't mean it's not there, right? And then, I think that whatever type of visionary, starting to recognize these things, and you know what, I'll just say this, like, most people, you do not want this type of vision, right? It's to be able to see all these different field entities and different types of spiritual forces and people's auric fields and stuff like that. You can't, well, I guess I'll just, say, I can see things like this. And I've had to sort of integrate that. It's not been easy, right? It's not easy. You don't really want that. Most people don't want to see this, right? So the thing is that whatever types of visions or types of higher perception or awareness, start with your basic life. Clear everything in your mind, your heart, just make your life very clear, very smooth. There's a process of removing unconscious patterns, trauma. I've talked about multiple times in shows, like I completely dissolve stress. I don't really experience stress at all anymore. Never, almost, 99% of the time. And, that I decided to do that because, I just thought, why not? But, I had an experience when I was in India in a village, and I was attacked by about 100 plus villagers, all carrying weapons on the edge of this cliff face, very close to being killed, right? Very easily I could have been killed. I made it out of there, alive, obviously. But that's what stress is for, right? Stress is life or death situations. Other than that, you don't need it, right? So you turn that. You don't want to generate cortisol necessarily. Try to make the body operate in the most optimal way. But that being said, these, playing around with psychedelics, it's maybe you get a vision, right? You see, or I don't know, but what entities are going to be populating you, right? Look at the Santo Daime Church. This is the ayahuasca cult, whatever. I mean, they get possessed all the time. I mean, you don't want to be possessed, man. You really don't. And it's not that you have to go into a state of paranoia, but to say, oh, there's nothing, there's just this physical world, and there's nothing there. Or to say, oh, there's demons around me, blah, blah, blah. Well, I mean, a lot of these things can be resolved through either higher forces that you can connect with, or your own self, as you generate different you say different types of resonant awareness frequencies and clearing. But you really want to not step into this if you have a lot of emotional, psychological issues and other things like that, because these are just going to get magnified. These are going to come up and grow, and then you don't even know. You can't recognize what is you, what is not you, and so it's best not to even enter into this field unless you're ready for it. And I think it will just unfold naturally. But I'm saying, it's not something that most people want, really. You don't really want to know what's around you and how many things are moving and here and there. I mean, it doesn't mean you have to be, encountering these all the time. But I think it's important just to recognize so that, you don't want a facile understanding. But also if you, like Adam Green, just makes fun of people and is all bullshit. Well, dude, wait and see, buddy. Unless you're just doing disinformation, you will encounter something. I'm not saying that he will, but I'm just hypothesizing he'll encounter some stuff and he'll have to rethink his knee-jerk reaction, because this, without finding your own center, which has to come through your connection with the ultimate field of creation. And you can, however you want to parse that, but I think it's very important. So anyways, enjoy this lecture. I think it's a very fascinating one, and it clears a lot of the debris away from some of these concepts, and it's scientifically, ascertained, right? It's created in a scientific modeling. So enjoy the lecture.
In today's lecture, we will look at what egregores are, and how dozens, hundreds, thousands, and even millions of people have been governed with the help of egregores for a long time. Speaking of the origin of the word egregor, there are several variants. From the word aggregate, which means the connection into one whole of dissimilar or homogeneous parts. The French word is aigret, which means a feather or a bunch of feathers sticking up that adorn a woman's headdress or hairstyle. What's more, the word egregor has become the property of all kinds of occult teachings. All sorts of clairvoyants use it. But we will look at egregores from the standpoint of the conception of social safety. And here all that informational, philosophical, ideological arsenal with which we have already familiarized ourselves will come in handy. What are the key concepts that should be kept in mind during the entire lecture when considering egregores? I'll be reminding you of them, but in general, these concepts are: the first is the foundation of the conception of social safety, the trinity of MIM worldview, matter, information, measure. In addition, the passing of information is always a process of governance. Second, you should remember the fundamental concepts of the sufficiently general theory of governance: the vector of goals, the vector of current state, the vector of error, a cycled in closed-circuit system, an object of governance, a subject of governance, feed-forward and feedback lines, stability in terms of predictability, structural and structureless methods of governance, the entire function of governance, and so on. All this must be kept in mind when considering egregores. Otherwise, you may find egregores a kind of abstraction, which is used by all sorts of occult teachings to obscure this word and concept. But they do not give us a clear, precise definition of what this word is actually vested with, and how all kinds of egregores specifically work in our daily life every day. However, this word has to be endowed with a clear measure of understanding. Third, these are the processes that take place in supersystems. What a supersystem is in general, what a supersystem consists of, what kind of elements are included in a supersystem, what characteristics the elements of a supersystem have, and so on. One must understand all these things, and then it becomes obvious that egregores are no miracles at all. Everything will be in its place in one's head, and we will deal with the topic of egregores sequentially. We already know that there is creation. All processes in creation are of an oscillatory nature. Man is a fragment of creation. He also emits vibrations, oscillations, through his biofields. And these oscillatory processes are endowed with some measure. Remember, we said that there is a carrier frequency and there is modulation. These are algorithms for processing incoming information, or a person's way of thinking, his worldview, world understanding. So, a person emits biofields. Oscillations are always a process of the trinity of MIM, matter information measure. Through his biofields, a person perceives everything at once. The sense of measure is a sense, like all other human senses: sight, hearing, smell, touch and taste. And each sense perceives a certain spectrum of frequencies. Human eyes perceive a certain frequency spectrum. Human ears perceive their own sound frequency range. We do not hear ultrasounds or infrasounds, and so on. But also a person has the sense of measure, which has its own frequency range. And through the sense of measure, a person perceives all oscillatory processes. Once I had the following experience. I was sitting on a stump in a forest after picking mushrooms. All of a sudden, a chill went down my back. I didn't hear anything, I didn't see anything. But when I looked around, I saw a viper crawling in my direction. Another case, which many find a miracle. A woman from the Moscow region had a son, who was drafted to serve in the Pacific Fleet. Once she was preparing dinner at home, and suddenly she felt that something had happened to her son. She felt bad. Later, it was confirmed that at that very moment, a misfortune had happened with her son. It should be noted that this case has nothing mystical. The mother was worried about her son and tuned into the corresponding wave of oscillations. And since the material carriers of the mother and the son are almost the same, when the son really had a misfortune, the mother perceived this wave of misfortune. The biocarrier of man's soul in creation is the substance of his biomass, pan-natural physical fields emitted by his biomass in the process of his life. But we do not know the entire plurality of fields. We know that a sensitivity, a resolution, an ability of discernment and recognition by the human organism, that is, the biogenic perception of the world, is higher than that of the means of scientific technological perception of the world. Here is an example. We know that outer space is studied and satellites are tracked. An aerial perceives some signal that comes to it, and this is reflected on devices by the deviation of the arrow. What is the technological base of science like? There are sensors that perceive some processes. For example, A satellite is in orbit. Different sensors detect pressure, temperature, battery voltage, etc. The signal from the sensor is amplified, undergoes various transformations. In particular, it is converted into digital form. Then the signal is processed on the onboard computer. Then it is converted again, and ultimately goes to the register. And a scientist explores the signal sent to a punch tape, or to an alphanumeric printing device, or to a computer. This is how the technological perception of oscillatory processes flowing in the surrounding world takes place. Summarizing the aforementioned, everything goes according to the following algorithm: sensor, amplifier, converter, computer processing, converter, register. Man's sensitivity, resolution, ability of discernment and recognition, that is, biogenic perception of the world, is much higher than the technological base of science. Thus, the organism as a whole and its elemental base, cells, possess a more subtle structure, a more complex organization than the technological base of science. Unlike devices, the hierarchy of the structures of a living person is complete and continuous. From the physical vacuum in which physical fields pass along, through atoms and chemical compounds, specific cells that form body tissues and organ systems, up to man himself and society as a whole. In other words, every kind of matter and aggregate states of matter are present in man. And many natural fields, frequency ranges, direction of polarization of fields, code systems, objectively existing in creation are, in principle, closed for technological perception due to incompleteness of the hierarchy of structures of technical means, low sensitivity of sensors, low resolution, low ability of discernment and recognition. That is, due to the crudeness of technical means of converting information, distorting and losing it in that transition from one material carrier to another. Why, by the way, has science not yet recognized the existence of biofields? Since the so-called Kirlian effect is only now being discovered. The Kirlian spouses discovered, according to indirect data, the glow of the hand, that is, the human biofield has been discovered relatively recently. Moreover, the biofield is not detected directly, but indirectly, by the effect of the biofield on the ions that exist in the atmosphere. So the biofield was determined by the glow of these ions, thanks to the photographs that were taken. But it was impossible to take those photographs before, because the technology of science was and is still much weaker than many natural fields. For this reason, the entire scientific world believes that there are no biofields. Our entire culture does not teach our children to consciously and according to the life-consistent reason govern their own sensitivity, resolution, ability of discernment and recognition. In addition, culture does not teach children to distinguish between different cultures of world perception and thinking, and cultivate in themselves a certain culture of thinking and a discipline of internal and external behavior. But some teach this. It becomes obvious if you stretch the thread back to the ancient Egyptian dresses, to shamans. However, such knowledge is not given to ordinary people. Moreover, these abilities can be independently cultivated if a person truly works on himself. So in society, technology takes domination over an ignorant or a pervertedly educated person. Instead of developing the genetically determined potential, revealing, opening the intellectual and creative potential, a person is turned into a mindless zombie by a robot, and artificial intelligence instead is created. Many processes of energetic informational exchange between every person and creation objectively flow, beyond direct conscious perception by people, outside of the technological perception base of science. But the objective non-existence of something and the impossibility of perceiving it, directly or indirectly, are not the same things. They are different things. To put it differently, objectively, there are some processes in creation that are not perceived by either a person or any technological base. In addition, a person is inclined to believe that this does not and cannot exist at all. However, the fact that we cannot perceive something due to the limitedness of our senses does not mean that this does not exist in principle. In relation to the study of mental, psychic, and nervous activity, the conclusion from the aforementioned is the following. If technology is crude and more primitive than man and society, then the best tool for understanding man is man himself and society. As one ancient Greek philosopher said, man is the measure of all things. Technology and computer processing may only be of a temporary interest. These studies are of interest primarily to the zombifiers of mankind, the result of which will be the death of mankind in general for everyone by robotization. Since, for the survival of the entire supersystem, it is necessary that as many elements of the supersystem as possible can preemptively detect the pressing factors on the supersystem as a whole. Then, if people are zombified in mass, they are deprived of their intellectual and creative potential, and hence the ability to detect pressing factors on the supersystem. Now, let's move on to the definition of egregor. Here is a picture which shows a person emitting a biofield, as well as perceiving the surrounding world through his biofield. Living people, like the rest of nature, emit pan-natural fields. Energy and information according to the measure that predetermines the existence of each and every living being. The set of biofields of biospheric organic origin is usually called a biofield. A person feels, senses, and perceives the world not only with his organs, built from the substance of his biomass, but also through the pan-natural fields inherent to his organism. To put it differently, a person perceives information through his biofield from the entire creation. If a certain plurality of people has similar parameters of their energetics, biofields, vibrations, oscillations, list of fields, frequencies of these fields, polarization, etc., then the biofield emission of the same information by many people generates an energetic informational system on field carriers, which in the occult sciences are called egregores. Simply speaking, roughly speaking, I emit oscillations, you emit oscillations, and if our oscillations coincide according to many parameters, then these oscillations enter into resonance and form a biofield structure on field carriers. Any oscillations carry certain information, endowed with a measure. And what is matter in this case? Matter is field structures. Remember, I told you that matter appears in the form of 5 aggregate states: solid, liquid, gas, plasma, particles, static and dynamic fields, and also a physical vacuum. These static and dynamic fields are the so-called subtle matter, the frequency characteristics of which are such that they are not included in the light frequency range of a person, so he does not see them. That is, the very human biofield is matter. In order to make the further material easier for perception, an image is given here. You see people, each of whom emits his own bifield. And if their characteristics coincide, then they form a certain common bifield, which is called egregor. And when they talk about channeling, when someone is connected with someone or something else, then it is just about connecting to a bifield, suprapersonal structure. People of art can take information from particular egregors, which they, within the boundaries of measure of their talents, form into something accessible to other people who are not connected to the corresponding egregors, or who do not know how to take information from these egregors. From all kinds of egregors, thoughts suddenly come to one's mind. New ideas suddenly become the property of one's own consciousness, and so on. Classification of egregors. According to the incoming into them information. One egregor has one information, another egregor has other information. In other words, egregors differ in content, according to the features of the energy of people connected to this egregor, according to the features of the energy potential, according to the organization of governance over this egregor. The thing is, the person of authority often has the quality of a programmer of the given egregor. Therefore, if there is another person of authority from the outside, then the latter can affect the content of the entire egregor and all the people belonging to it, simply by influencing the programmer of the egregor. Moreover, egregors in creation are also hierarchically ordered according to nravistness. If one egregor is higher than another one, then the first one can influence the second, and from a higher level, where the measure of understanding and nravistness is higher, governing impacts are also exerted by this egregor. People are close in terms of the parameters of their energetics, despite the peculiarities of these parameters, and are conditioned by genetics, physiology, general emotional structure, type of psyche, mood at a certain point in time or at a time interval. Therefore, in the formation of human egregors, the informational characteristics, peculiarities of people and the community of people are more significant, but not energy compatibility, which is initially determined by the belonging to a people, race, humanity. After all, look, we are all the same in terms of the material carrier. I mean, we are composed of what we eat and drink, and the informational content of our behavior is different, and it is determined precisely by the measure. Further on, if we talk about the classification of egregors, then human egregors are nested in biospheric ones, which in their turn are nested in planetary egregors, and so on, up to the egregor of creation. For example, the egregor of Russia, the egregor of the USA, of China, and so on. All these human egregors are nested in biospheric egregors. The biospheric egregors are nested in the egregor of the planet Earth, which is nested in the egregor of the galaxy, and so on, up to the egregor of creation. Egregors can be mutually hierarchical. Remember, we studied cycled in closed-circuit supersystems, when one supersystem enters another. The same concerns egregors, when one egregor has some of its fragments placed in another egregor, and the latter, in its turn, has some of its fragments placed in the first egregor. They can complement each other in some part. One egregor complements the algorithmics of another egregor with its part, while the latter complements the algorithmics of the first egregor. Egregors can be neutrally compatible. That is, when egregors are in contact with each other, but nothing happens. Egregors can be mutually antagonistic, that is, incompatible with each other. Well, you probably found yourself in a party of some kind, with everyone having fun, which means that everyone emitted their own biofields. That is, an egregor was formed. Suddenly, the doorbell rang, a new person arrived. He had hardly opened his mouth and looked at anyone. But the situation had changed radically. What was this? It was a carrier of another information that had come, and people unconsciously felt it. It was expressed in their behavior. That is, this is an example of the antagonism of the egregores. But the antagonism is determined by conceptions. The same thing happens in the confrontation between egregores of various religious cults. For example, Catholicism and Orthodoxy, Christians and Muslims, Muslims and Buddhist Vedic believers, Sunnis and Shiites in Islam, and so on. Since we say that all processes are of an oscillatory nature and flow in the trinity of MIM, matter, information, measure, then egregores can be viewed from the standpoint of the trinity. In the energy or material, because energy is a transitional form of matter, relation, people generate egregores in the same way as power plants and devices connected to the network. So, from any power plant, electricity goes through power supply networks to factories, households, and so on. How does an egregor work? People emit oscillations and consume oscillations. Within the framework of one egregor, there are such participants who give energy to the egregor, and there are such participants who consume energy from the egregor. At other time intervals, people change roles. Those who were an energy resource in relation to the egregor become consumers of energy from this egregor, and vice versa. In terms of information, people generate an egregor in the same way as many computers connected through informational exchange channels, which can be organized into an informational processing network. So there may be an internet network when a personal computer is connected to a communication line, and through the communication line is connected to the exchange of information. The exact same thing happens to people. Where is the computer in us? In our head, right? Therefore, through the emission of oscillations, we pass information to an egregor. Meanwhile, others can read this information. You can also draw parallels with a supersystem, in which every element has memory, on the basis of which this element can be self-governed, pass information to other elements governing them, and receive information from them, being under their governance. This is how egregores work. The knowledge of the sufficiently general theory of governance plus cybernetic analogies immediately puts everything in its place. It seems to be easy to understand all this, but for this, nevertheless, it is necessary to recognize, admit the objective existence of information, which materialists haven't done yet. But information objectively exists, and it is measured. The measure in an egregor is its algorithmics of transformation of information in the process of egregorial governance over those who form this egregor. This algorithmics manifests itself in the statistics of mass behavior. An algorithm is a certain sequence of actions. So we emit information in a certain sequence of transformations and receive information by processing it in a certain sequence of transformations. To generalize this, we say that algorithmics is a set of algorithms in the psyche, or in the collective psyche, that is, an egregor. These are the rules by which we live. What things govern us in a structureless way? Remember the priorities of generalized means of governance. So, a Christian is told, strengthened with all might, according to his glorious power, unto all patience and long-suffering with joyfulness. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, Turn to them the other cheek also. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. And the person behaves in a needed, probabilistically predetermined manner in certain situations. Now a situation is created, and a person has certain information in his head, endowed with a certain measure, and he acts in accordance with the algorithms programmed in him. And he humbly endures long-suffering with joyfulness, where it is necessary to act, phases, where it is necessary to wait and perceive power in its real quality. That is, this person does not change anything, because let every person be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. So, with the help of the algorithm of transformation of incoming information, which was imposed on him, it becomes clear how he will act in certain situations. Thus, a person is governed in a structureless way, and the consequences of such governance are already known. Therefore, the rules of life, generally speaking, are reduced to two conceptions. The previous one, when the person lives according to his service and his sense of measure, and the unprevious one is when the person drags himself against God. This unprevious conception is hammered into people's heads through the education system, historical myths, religions, ideologies, science, other knowledge, and so on, forming a kaleidoscope in people's minds. And for some people, their algorithm is that all processes are interdependent, interconditioned, and so on. Then, when they see workers on strike, they ask the question, why are they on strike? Because their salaries were not paid. Why weren't their salaries paid? Because their employer is to blame. And the people can stop at this and say, they say this is not a good employer. But the one who knows the holistic picture of creation, knows the hierarchy of governance, he will immediately think, why did the employer not pay the salaries? Because the crisis of the world financial credit system came, or because the employer was not granted a loan. Why wasn't he granted a loan? Because his company is about to collapse. Why should his company collapse? Because a global policy is being implemented in relation to our country, according to which our country should be dismembered, and so on. If you have such a holistic view, then this is one worldview and one algorithm. And according to another algorithm, the employer is bad, the workers are poor and unhappy, and that's it. A person does not know the cause and effect relationships, does not see how governance is carried out. He does not know. Therefore, he easily falls into negative emotions, in which he wastes away his life. As we have touched upon strikes, then why are strikes, demonstrations allowed? Moreover, they are encouraged. They are allowed and encouraged for the reason that people let off steam on strikes and demonstrations. Nothing is decided through this, and nothing can be radically changed. Moreover, these strikes can be used for one's own political purposes. Do you know what the minor strikes led to under Yeltsin? They contributed to the destruction of the country's national economic complex. Why? The miners went on strike. There was no coal. The CHP plants did not generate electricity, and this led to the fact that the blast furnaces stopped. There was no metal. No metal. Harvesters were not being made. As harvesters were not being made, there were no harvesters to reap grain, and that's all. Here is the cause-effect relationship. So, who did these strikers work for? They wanted to defend their interests, fight for their own rights, but not knowing the work of the national economic complex as a whole. They worked for their own collapse and impoverishment. After the strikes, the prices for oil were increased. Why were the prices for oil increased? Because milk had become more expensive. Why did milk become more expensive? Because there was nothing to feed the cow, and so on and so forth. Therefore, such a holistic perception of the world will pose the question not on the need to go on strike, but on the fact that the conception needs to be changed. Strikes will not solve anything. Moreover, strikes are needed to destroy a country. But if everything that I said is announced to an unprepared person, he will object. He will say, "You're not a patriot. You're not fighting for the rights of the people." Therefore, people are pushed to go on strikes with the purpose to prevent them from understanding the reasons for what is happening. I emphasize once again, an egregor is a bifield structure. That is, it is material and it cannot exist without people. An egregor carries in itself certain information, which is measured and ordered in accordance with the measure. But this is not a jumble of different people, but an egregor is determined by a certain informational content, when the information and algorithms of many people coincide. Now, let's move on to the cybernetic analogy. Let's develop further what we've just talked about. If there is a computer network, if there is software, a set of algorithms that ensures the operation of the entire computer network, then this computer network can be an integral, holistic informational system, hierarchically higher in relation to every one of the computers included in it. So, it turns out that an egregor is much more powerful than every person connected with it. The only difference is that a person is more complex than a machine, and the possibilities of energetic informational exchange between people are much wider than in any computer network. So, one more time, an egregor is formed by people who, due to their coincidence of their bifields, form a certain egregor. The determining thing in an egregor is information and algorithmics measure. The people connected with the egregor exchange information and algorithmics with each other, not always realizing this. It turns out that an egregor, in this sense, is much more powerful than one person. It is hierarchically higher in its potential. A person can connect to an egregor and gain access to knowledge that previously did not belong to him, the author of which was not originally him. You can often hear from people the phrase, "A thought or an idea came to me." In this case, you should ask yourself or your interlocutor, the one whom the thought visited, where did it come from? Did it appear from a chemical reaction in the brain or what? In a developed computer network, the distribution of information and functional load along its elements can be different. From the control, ruling of the network as an integrity, including the ruling over free resources, elements included in it, to the solving of particular tasks that are not of independent interest, but are important as fragments of more general tasks solved in the network. Similar processes take place in the biosphere in general, and in human societies in particular. Therefore, various informational cybernetic analogies make it possible to understand a lot in the life of society and the biosphere. Let's talk about egregors and their relationship with the technosphere. Here is a picture of a person. On one side of it, the grass is green, the sun is shining, the trees are growing, the birds are singing, generally speaking, virgin nature. On the other side of it, there are roads, cars, planes flying, chemical plants working. The technosphere is generated by the biosphere. So everything in the technosphere is created by man, and man is part of the biosphere. The technosphere is generated by the biosphere, but the technosphere influences the biospheric egregores. Technical means of processing, storing, transmitting information, computer networks, radio, television, cinema, mass media, involve people in technospheric informational flows, and therefore are technical means of supporting various egregores. Look, here is a very interesting picture in this sense. There are people. They form a certain egregor, but at the same time, people come into contact with the technosphere. One works on a PC on the internet, another one watches TV, a third one is with a receiver and headphones, a fourth one reads a newspaper. Besides, these people are connected to the egregor through their biofields. Technical means exert their influence on people's matter of understanding, generally speaking, on their biofields. Therefore, the information that people consume from the internet, TV, mass media gets into this egregor. In other words, technical means exert their influence on the formation of the egregor. Television, internet, social networks, radio act as the means of the most synchronous enclosure of the psyche of many people to certain egregors. So, technical means have become a means of governance over masses of people. Beforehand, the enclosure of the psyche of many people took place every Saturday in synagogues, churches, and other religious institutions depending on the belief. In the Vedic magical culture of the pseudo-Zhretskut of our time, the internet and television have taken on the role of a temple of antiquity, as an enclosure of the psyche of the thoughtless and stereotypical thinking crowd to certain egregors. People came to religious institutions for Mass, Sunday evening service, and the priest told them how to behave, how to live, and so on. That is, for brainwashing. This is the same informational influence, as a result of which the psyche of people was enclosed into certain stereotypes of behavior. This was how egregors were formed, and at the beginning every person took part in the formation of an egregor, and then became a hostage of that egregor. At those times, the means of supporting an egregor was a temple. And now, the means of synchronous support for an egregor is the internet, TV, mass media, social networks. That is, nothing has changed functionally, only the means of synchronous support have improved. Computer games are very trendy now. Children of many parents nowadays cannot live without computer games, without gadgets, and so on. Many parents ask me if this is good or bad. Well, it depends on the standpoint of which conception you look at it from. It should be recalled here that we said that a person can live in three types of civilization: biogenic, biotechnological, and technospheric. That is, if a person is a hostage of technology, this is one situation, and if technology helps him, this is a different situation. Many computer games are interactive programming of the psyche. In them, unlike TV and the internet as a whole, the impact on the psyche of everyone is enclosed by feed-forward and feedback lines. In other words, through a computer game, in principle, a deeper zombification is possible than on TV and the internet, aimed at the average viewer. To put it differently, when a person surfs the internet or watches TV, he can think about something and somehow react consciously, in a meaningful way. While playing computer games, the hands are on the keyboard or joystick. If all the information that flows out of the computer into a person during his game is understood as a subject of governance, then the person turns out to be an object of governance. As a result of such addition to the screen and his real position in the scheme of governance with respect to a computer game, he becomes a prisoner, since feedback lines hold him more firmly in obedience. Here is an example for you to understand the strength and power of feedback. Nowadays, in many television and radio programs, feedback consists of the fact that listeners or viewers are invited to an interactive mode. This is usually a mode of direct online calls, SMS voting, and so on, in order to more rigidly chain people to screens and govern them. Feedback chains people. Another tool for governance and manipulation over people's minds is the so-called public opinion poll. Especially during pre-election campaigns, such polls program people to make one or another decision in relation to one or another candidate. How is it done? For example, 5 candidates go toe-to-toe, as polls show. But, as Ostap Bender said in the film The 12 Chairs, all these polls are done in Odessa, on Malaya Arnautskaya Street. In other words, on the screen we can see different numbers, votes for this or that candidate. Are you going to check this data? All this data is generated by pushing a button on a computer, like all ratings. But what can be done? If it is necessary for candidate X to win, then from the very beginning it is necessary to tell people and show them the rating that 80% of votes are for the needed candidate and 1 to 2% for candidate Y. They show you this the first day, the second day. And then even those who were initially for candidate Y, realizing that their candidate Y will not win anyway, vote for candidate X. That is, people are programmed to perform certain actions. We already explored this when looking into the sufficiently general theory of governance. Governance based on probabilistic predeterminations, that is, structureless governance. I do not tell people to vote for candidate X, but I do give such information that they themselves, in a probabilistic predetermined way, will do it, being sure that this is their own opinion, and that's it, done. Although, with the help of technology, it is possible to contribute to the formation and activity of egregores, the crudeness of technology in comparison with the human body does not allow making a biorobot out of the one who wants to create himself as a human, according to God's predetermination. It comes to the fact that if a person is striving to find the truth, if a person is striving to acquire an irreversibly human type of psychic structure, if he develops his sense of measure, then any zombifiers, any unprevious influence will not work on him. And the best way for such a person is to enter into a direct dialogue with God, without any middleman like priests. In fact, this is the same as with the problem of artificial intelligence. It is the problem of prosthetics of one's own brains and intellect as an informational algorithmic process, because one does not want to use one's own brain. However, a prosthesis is always inferior to a natural organ or organ system. The one who wants will figure it out, and the conception of social safety will only help such a person in this matter. Now, let's move on to the interaction of man with egregores. Egregores and people exchange energy and information with each other. At the moment of death, a human body emits fields, energy, information, and algorithmics that carry the spirit and soul away from the body. These fields, in a probabilistically predetermined way, can get into the egregor, which is energetic informationally correspondent to a person's spirit. Since, in essence, there are two types of spirit and psyche, there is an individual psyche, or individual spirit, and a collective psyche, or collective spirit. The latter is an egregor. So the individual psyche after death is divided between those egregors to which it corresponded during life. So the biography of this person's life becomes the property of his family egregors. The biography of his career, aside from the family egregor, becomes the property of professional egregors, and so on. Therefore, people who try to find out their past incarnations bump into some kind of recorded biography of someone who once lived. That is, they can see scraps of lives of more than one person in a regressive hypnosis. However, all this does not concern the human soul, which, after separation from its spirit, returns to the Creator. This means that every person is primarily a soul. So, in accordance with the general natural laws of conservation and transformation of energy and information, fragments of a human spirit are distributed between egregors, and the same fragments can be part of several egregors at the same time. For example, in religious and all sorts of occult teachings, a person after death can only go to two opposite egregors, to heaven or hell. In a person, matter is a body and biofields. Information is the psyche as a whole, recorded on biofields. A measure that has a key quality is the soul. The body is mortal. The spirit is changeable and transformable. That is, it can be changed and transformed. But the soul is eternal. And if the spirit can be previous or unprevious, then the soul of every person is previous in its essence and cannot be changed. That is, you cannot change the soul. That is why in the novel The Master and Margarita, Yeshua, Jesus, said that all people are Dobries, there are no evil people in the world. He meant their souls, not psyches. The psyche should only not interfere with the soul from manifesting all its privateness. For this, you need to become a true human with the capital H, to acquire an irreversibly human type of psyche structure. You know, many scientists say, the star died and went out, but the light from it flows for millions and billions of years. It is the same with a person. After all, what is light? This is an oscillation. A human spirit is also an oscillation. Look, the matter of a person, his body, has extinguished, and his vibrations, spirit, psyche, can continue to shine, while the biofields remaining in the corresponding egregors. Everything that a person had in his life, his thoughts, dreams, aspirations, desires, fears, and so on, is in egregors. And if you tune yourself into the corresponding vibration resonant wave, you can get access to those thoughts and aspirations. Thus, many people find themselves under the egregorial influence of their ancestors, regardless of whether their ancestors are still alive or not. But in the same way, you can tune yourself into the Holy Spirit. For this, Russian saints went far into the forest, went on a diet, water and bread, to clean their cells and body, thereby attuning it to nature, and then they prayed, in order to enter into resonance with the Holy Spirit. They went into the forest, away from the hustle and bustle of daily life, away from the church. Since in churches there are all kinds of interference, priests singing, all sorts of noises, beautiful girls walking by. Thus, there are no thoughts about God. They went away from ritual duties, beautiful robes, all sorts of smells that distract from thoughts on God. I devoted 3 years to the study of all Christian rituals and came to the conclusion that there is no smell of God in them. There, everything goes according to a strictly outlined program. At time, one has to sing, lower raise one's head, light a candle, cross oneself, and so on. In such conditions, a person only thinks how not to lose his faith and perform the ritual perfectly, but he does not think about God as it should be. In nature, however, a person attunes himself with the Holy Spirit much easier, since thoughts about God come naturally there. What is the Holy Spirit? These are the same fields that permeate the entire universe, the informational algorithmic content of which is the Creator's privateness. And if you attune your spirit with the spirit of the Creator, then you begin to acquire the light of the Creator into your psyche, and thereby become holy, that is, filled with light. Many people, by the nature of the information they carry, and different fragments of their informational content in general, can correspond to different egregores. So, the same person is simultaneously connected to many egregores. Moreover, the mood tuning of a person and the structure of his psyche can change. The dynamics of changes of circumstances also change. Therefore, at any moment of time, a person is a participant in different egregores. So, a person wakes up in a good mood. He participates in one egregorial combinatrix. He has breakfast, hops in his car, he goes to work. Within this time, he is connected to an egregor of drivers. Then he comes to work, where he gets pissed off. The combinatrix changes. He falls into a state of anger, into an egregor of anger and irritation. And this egregor helps him. And this person cannot stop. Everything annoys him. Then he decides to drink or smoke in order to relax, and thus he gets into an egregor of smokers or an egregor of those who drink alcohol. The same applies to biofield correspondence, that is, the peculiarities of attuning a person's energy as an emitter or as a receiver, independent of the nature of the information considered. As a result, at different periods of time and at different moments within the same period, people can interact with different egregors, and egregors can have energetic and informational algorithmic effects on the same person at the same time, complementing each other, alternating among themselves, getting into conflicts concerning the possession of the person. Now, let's talk about the lifetime of an egregor. In the picture, you see a time scale of several thousand years. Below it, for comparison, there is a frequency scale of social and biological time. By the way, you may think, what happens to egregors after a change of the frequencies of social and biological time, when the social frequency becomes higher than the biological frequency? The egregors which do not have stability are destroyed, in particular the biblical egregor, because information circulates rapidly, and everything of a secret nature becomes apparent and obvious at an accelerating pace. The stability of egregors at such a time is ensured by their informational algorithmic indicators, in other words, their nervousness. So the composition of people connected to an egregor changes as they move along the time scale. So some people die, other people are born and connect to this egregor. And thus the egregor lives for thousands of years and retains information and algorithmics of people who lived long ago. That is, an egregor changes material carriers. Remember the supersystems with their regenerative element base. Therefore, the thoughts of people who died long ago may suddenly become the property of the psyche of living people, according to the principle, a thought came to me. Therefore, the lifetime of an egregor can be historically very long and cover many generations. Those who shape and content egregors know how to maintain them for even millennia. These are all sorts of occult schools, church orders. They can use a different terminological apparatus. I mean, they may call the same phenomenon by different names. but they work with egregores. In addition, in the ranks of an order, this information can only be possessed by the initiates, and those lower in the rank may not possess this information. An egregor is a whole single organism, but formed not from matter, but from the fields that people who are part of the egregor have. Here is a picture. I want to emphasize that this is just a schematic representation for educational convenience. In reality, everything is a little different, since it does not have any clear geometric shapes. Here are people who are part of this egregor. Some people have one kind of frequency characteristics, others have different frequency indicators, and so on. In relation to an egregor, the biofield structure of every person and group of people occupies the same hierarchical place, as in the composition of the individual human body are occupied by cells, specialized organs, systems of organs. The only difference is that the assembly of the organism of an egregor into a single integrity in the hierarchy of creation is carried out not at the level of biomass of matter, but at the level of a biofield. At the same time, just as in the human body, there is a process of cell regeneration. So, in an egregor, there is a regeneration of people connected to this egregor. People are born in long-lived egregors, grow under their care, and having become adults, people with their biofields support the egregor until their bodily death, or until the exit from this egregor. So an egregor is a suprapersonal factor of governance, in the sense that the actions of people connected to the egregor are coordinated by this egregor, so that they complement each other in accordance with the personal capabilities of every person in a certain integral, egregorial, purpose-oriented process. This happens due to the fact that an egregor has information about everything that concerns its specification and about all the participants. All this organizes the activities of people, and they act in such a way that people complement each other concerning informational egregorial algorithmics, continue informational egregorial algorithmics, and are functional parts of informational egregorial algorithmics. This is carried out through long-range channels of energetic informational exchange of a biofield nature. And there is even the fact that people do not know anything about each other. Meanwhile, the collective spirit, the egregor, knows about each and every of them in particular. Every egregor is a suprapersonal factor, capable of various types of governance and governing people to a greater or lesser extent. It is important to understand that what has been said does not mean that egregors control, manipulate us, like some kind of robots. No, this is not the case. They govern probabilistic predeterminations, sometimes in a pretty tough way. But a person lives in certain circumstances, and a prompt regarding his current life circumstances can come to him through an egregor. The content of this prompt is a different matter. To put it differently, if a person comes into contact with something hierarchically higher, then this is not a guarantee that this hierarchically higher something is God. It can be an egregor. If a person is not honest in his own thoughts, if he does something in life against his savist, then the person will enter into a dialogue not with God, but with one of the egregors. I myself have met such people who, in an altered state of consciousness, entered into dialogue with egregors. Their hands began to write things somehow of their own volition. I read such things, and I can say that there were really noteworthy theses and items. Such people can predict cataclysms, earthquakes, and so on. But further on, the question arises, where did they get it all from? So, for example, one such a female clairvoyant, at the end of a message that she received, wrote, "Evelyn." To my questions, "Who is Evelyn?" I only received a shake of her head. That is, the clairvoyant could not answer me. So, it is clear that this was an egregor. But how to determine exactly whether you are in a dialogue with God or with an egregor? Moreover, what degree of darkness, that is, the amount of mistakes, is this egregor? We have already talked about this. Only with the help of analysis of stability in terms of predictability, that is, how often recommendations and information turn out to be life-consistent, corresponds to life reasoning. The more often information is life-consistent, the less the egregor is darkened, and the higher hierarchically it is, and the closer its nervousness is to priviousness. And what comes from God turns out to be life-consistent in 100% of cases. An egregor is one of the sides of an objective social phenomenon called spiritual culture. Generation and transformation of egregors, characteristic of societies of egregors, collective spirits, subordinates. What is spiritual culture? Does it mean to stand with a candle in a church, or to read some spiritual books about the lives of the saints? We say that spiritual culture is the biofeld informational algorithmic life of both a single person and people collectively. The existence of egregors is objective, but the entire materialistic science, the entire social system in which we live, the culture in which our children and we grow up, do not recognize, do not admit, do not understand, do not know, and do not want to know all this. This is horrible, actually. But this is an objective phenomenon of creation, and not only of human societies. This should be taught in schools and kindergartens. It is necessary to teach a person to master this, to develop skills of interaction with egregors. But materialists assert that this is impossible. Therefore, this simply does not exist. The conception of social safety is also an egregor. But how does it differ from the egregors of Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Vedic Buddhist? The fact is that, in the aforementioned egregors of the teachings, people follow these egregors by default in the informational background. Egregors affect them by passing their consciousness. The egregor of the conception of social safety is such that its followers act with a sense of measure, realizing what they do. That is, they act consciously, with an understanding of the ongoing processes. Therefore, we say that one should not be afraid of any information. One should work with information. After all, information is objective. By prohibitions, you cannot restrict people from information. Many try to prohibit, to restrict access to knowledge. All this is nonsense. Remember, Mikhail Afanasyevich Bulgakov said, "Manuscripts do not burn." So, what do we have to do? We have to consciously relate to information, distinguishing the true from the false, the right from the wrong, the previous from the unprevious. We have to possess the criterion, the distinction. In order to distinguish, discern, we must have the MIM worldview, matter-information measure, an understanding of the processes of governance and self-governance, both in society, supersystem, and in creation as a whole. So, we already know that the power of an egregor is much greater than the energetic informational power of a person. Therefore, if the settings of a person's energetics correspond to a certain egregor, then the egregor can energetically grab him and carry him away. energetically burn him out, energetically crush him, energetically devour him. An example of a person being energetically grabbed by an egregor can be a situation which you all might have experienced. This is when a person has an obsession which does not let him go. As a result, a person burns himself out from inside, devours himself, and so on. This is how an egregor can bring the person even to death. This is one of the reasons why we claim that all diseases are informational in nature.
Coded in music, media, and memory. I'm Dr. Hans Utter, and I invite you into the resonant state. Join me as we explore the secrets of sound, mind control, consciousness, and the frequencies that shape your world. Subscribe now. We tune your perception.